People are walking through the crowded street filled with cars. Matthew Faber, a middle-aged wealthy Frenchman, opens the door of his car and walks into a shop. He approaches two people at the counter and sits on the chair. He tells them he would like to buy a first-class sleeper ticket from Seville to Paris for later that day. The man at the counter tells him he has no tickets for tonight, but he can make a 2-ticket reservation for Matthew to go as far as Madrid, and then transfer into a sleeper until Paris. Matthew agrees and asks if his suitcases and a trunk can be picked up and forwarded to Paris. The man writes the ticket for Matthew. Matthew continues his drive and the car stops in front of a villa. He asks the waiter about some woman, and the waiter tells him she left 5 minutes ago. Matthew asks him to come with him and they both go inside the house. Matthew and the waiter enter the room and find a bloody pillow and broken items all over the room. Matthew explains the blood is only from the woman's nose and everything is fine. He tells the waiter to burn the pillow. The waiter also notices the female shoes and tells Matthew the woman must have left barefoot. He continues talking about a man he worked for, who would often repeat a philosophical saying about needing to have a stick close by whenever you are with a woman. A driver walks out of the car to wait for a man in a suit. The man walks out of the building smoking a cigarette, checks his watch, enters the car, and tells the driver to take him to the bank. As he starts the car, it explodes, blowing the car up in pieces. The crowd gathers to look at what happened. Matthew is there too in one of the cars, and he says he can't believe another attack happened. He tells the driver to hurry so he won't be late for his next meeting. Matthew and the waiter arrive at the train station and enter into separate train cars. Matthew enters one of the cabins and finds his seat. He is seated across from a woman who is traveling with her daughter. The woman asks if they perhaps live on the same street in Paris because she must have seen him before. They continue talking about preferring a train ride over a plane ride, and how riding in a plane these days can take them to the desert. Another man walks in saying the woman is sitting in his place, and then comforts her and tells her it's fine as he will choose the next available seat. She explains she needs to sit facing forward or she will get nauseous. Matthew recognizes the man from the law's offices where his cousin works, and the man confirms he was there because he is a judge. Matthew tells him his cousin's name, and the man introduces himself as Vincent Dolarx. An onboard train service employee arrives and brings in the bag of yet another passenger short in height. The girl approaches to help him, but he tells her there is no need for that. He chats for a while with Vincent about the bullfight they both attended, and the man proceeds to read the newspapers. The train is late, so Matthew gets up to light a cigarette near the window. He notices a young woman walking into one of the train cars. Matthew observes the woman as she moves through the train and finally exits on the other side. Matthew then approaches the train service employee to ask him for a favor. He gives him some money and the conductor leaves. The woman walking at the train station is about to enter the train at the entrance where Matthew is standing, but the train starts moving. She tells him in a crying voice he can't leave in this way. Matthew spills a bucket of water over her head. The woman drops the suitcase on the floor and enters the train at the next entrance. The train continues the journey. Matthew returns the bucket and thanks the conductor. He returns to his cabin along with other passengers. There is a moment of silence interrupted by the question of Isabelle, a girl traveling with her mother. She wants to know why Matthew spilled water on the young woman. Soon the other passengers join the conversation and express their curiosity about what Matthew did. One of the passengers is a psychology professor, and the other one is willing to hear Matthew's explanation of what happened because their mutual acquaintance, and Matthew's cousin, often praised him. Matthew decides to tell the group the story of what happened. As a group was on trial, Matthew arrived to wait for his cousin at the end of the session. Matthew is drinking tea and waiting for his cousin Edouard in his office. Edouard arrives and takes off the judge's robe and gets ready to leave with Matthew. Matthew is interested in hearing about what happened during the trial. Edouard tells him the members of the terrorist group were not sentenced to as many years in prison as was expected, and the jury members were threatened by the group that was responsible for another bombing. They both exit the room to go for lunch at Matthew's. Edouard asks what is on the menu, and Matthew explains in detail. Edouard expresses a desire to go to the kitchen to see the meal being prepared, and Matthew puts out his cigarette and decides to accompany him. Matthew meets the new chambermaid who enters the room to bring in the vase. She tells him her name is Kinita. She explains she is Spanish but speaks fluent French as she has been living there for a long time. As Matthew is telling the story, the group on the train interrupts him, asking if the girl in the story is the same girl he spilled the bucket of water on. Matthew confirms that it is the same girl and continues the story. Matthew and Edouard are sitting at the table having lunch and talking about the attacks. Conchita walks in to pour the wine, and Matthew corrects her, telling her she is pouring the wine in the wrong glass. She excuses herself, saying she is still learning. Matthew picks up his glass so Conchita can pour some wine. Once she leaves, he comments on the delicacy of her hands and how she probably never worked with her hands before. Sometime later, the waiter, Martin, walks in, and Matthew asks him to bring him a glass of chartreuse. Martin asks him about the type of drink he would like and leaves the room. Soon, Conchita arrives carrying a tray with the drink Matthew ordered. She looks a bit different than in a previous scene, and this duality is noticeable throughout the story. Matthew tells her he won't be treating her like a servant and asks her more questions. She reveals she used to work in an office and a cloakroom in a small town bar. She explains she left due to the atmosphere there, and tells him about her family and how she had a strict upbringing. She says her mother lives in the suburbs of Paris, and she is mostly working to help her mother, but it doesn't give her too much pleasure and it is difficult for her to get used to the people and situation around there. What she really likes to do is to dance, but it's not something she can do for a living. Matthew asks her about her age and Kinita tells him she is 18, and he proceeds to kiss her, but she gets up, tells him it is late, and she is going to bed, and leaves the room. Matthew seems annoyed by what happened and throws the pillow. The next morning, Matthew is sitting at the dining table. Martin brings him juice. Matthew asks where Kinita is, and Martin explains she has been gone since the morning and he doesn't have her contact information since she arrived to work only recently and he doesn't know much about her. Back to the present moment, Matthew asks the passengers if he is boring them and they say they want him to continue the story. Matthew is observing the swans in the water. He then turns around and starts walking through the park. A young man stops him asking for a lighter. Matthew starts looking for the lighter, but a few other young men approach and surround him. The young man in front of him takes out his knife. They tell Matthew to give him the money. Matthew is about to give them his wallet, but the young man says they only need 800 francs. Matthew then takes out the money and gives them the bills, and the group lets him go. On his way through the park, Matthew passes by a police officer. For a moment he dwells on whether he should stop him and ask for help, but the moment passes and Matthew decides to continue walking. Matthew sits down to read the newspaper and he thanks the guy who brought him the newspapers. Soon after, the group of young men who robbed Matthew appears again. Kinita is with them and she approaches Matthew. He is surprised to see her and she tells her the guys who robbed him are her friends and they were on tour. She wants to return the money to Matthew. He insists that she keeps it and she promises to return it when she can. Matthew wants to know why she left and she explains it was because he was too affectionate. Before she leaves, she tells him her address in Paris. She gets up and returns to her friends, and Matthew picks up a tissue on the floor she dropped. Matthew is climbing up the stairs of a building. He asks for directions to Kinita's apartment and knocks on the door. Kinita's mother opens and Kinita explains Matthew is the man who gave them money. Her mother asks him to come in and invites him for a cup of coffee. She explains she is in a poor financial situation because her husband passed away. Matthew looks at his picture and Kinita explains he ended. Kinita's mom says they were left with debts and she doesn't have any working skills. She also doesn't like her daughter working. Matthew offers to lend them more money and Kinita's mother accepts with gratitude. She excuses herself and says she needs to leave, and invites Matthew to stay longer. Matthew and Kinita start talking. He touches her dress and she tells him she is not that kind of a girl and that, if he thinks she is, he should leave. She asks him to bring her the box placed on the mantle. Matthew does as she says and Kinita opens the box, finds a candy, and puts it in Matthew's mouth. Matthew tells the group on the train that he was captivated by Kinita. The group can't hear him as the train is passing through a tunnel. Matthew continues talking and explains he went to see Kinita every day for a month. Vincent suggests waiting for a moment before continuing the story due to the noise. Matthew arrives once again at Kinita's apartment. She is having a dance lesson with one of her friends, and he is playing the instrument as Kinita is dancing. Matthew and Kinita's friend recognize each other from the park. Matthew says he brought some coffee, cookies, and also bought a purse for Kinita. She suggests that Matthew should give it to her mother as she would love the present. Kinita first changes her clothes and then sings a song in Spanish for Matthew. He doesn't understand the words, so she translates the lyrics of the love song to him. First, Matthew tries to kiss Kinita and then Kinita kisses Matthew and then tells him that he doesn't love her. She amuses him and he likes her, but not love. They recall the first time they met. Matthew says that he thinks every day about what he can do for Kinita. Kinita's mother walks in and thanks Matthew for the cookies and the coffee. She says she is glad Kinita doesn't work and how young women are more led astray by the advice of women than men. Matthew wants to know why Kinita is rejecting him and she explains she has never been with a man. Kinita's mother is walking down the street with a friend. Martin approaches them and asks Kinita's mother to come with him. She agrees and enters the car. Martin takes her to Matthew's office, where Matthew reveals he would like Kinita to move in with him and he needs her mother's help in getting her there. He also offers an envelope with money for her to keep in the meantime. As they are speaking, Martin takes out the mouse trap with the mouse that has just been caught. Matthew and Martin are preparing the home for Kinita's arrival. They move the TV into another room. Matthew is expecting Kinita to arrive any moment, but instead of Kinita, one of her friends arrives carrying a letter from Kinita. Matthew opens it and reads it. In the letter, it says Kinita was willing to give herself to Matthew, but he tried to buy her out from her mother and he will never see her again. Martin tells Matthew that Kinita's not going to show up and Matthew throws away the flower he was holding in his hand. Matthew drives his car to Kinita's apartment. The woman who lives there tells him Kinita and her mother moved away and packed their bags. Matthew thinks they could come back for the furniture, but the lady tells him the furniture was rented with the apartment. Sometime later, Matthew is sitting in the restaurant with his cousin Edward. Matthew is telling him about what happened with Kinita, and Edward is surprised to see him like that. He advises him to go traveling for a while or meet other women, and tries to comfort him by saying Kinita might have been with him because of his money. Matthew doesn't want to hear about moving on and continues to talk about what he would do if Kinita was around. As they are talking, a waiter notices a fly in Matthew's glass and takes away the glass. Matthew and Edward get up to leave the restaurant. Edward arrives first to the cloakroom and recognizes Kinita, who is working there. He asks her if they know each other and she confirms. Soon Matthew arrives and asks Edward why he is in such a rush. Edward subtly points him to the cloakroom and leaves the restaurant. Matthew approaches Kinita, surprised to see her there. She tells him she has been working there for a few days and her shift is starting soon. As they are talking, her employer arrives, reminding her not to speak to customers while she is working. Kinita takes off her uniform and tells Matthew that she just resigned and she doesn't work there anymore. He invites her for a drink and she suggests the restaurant they are in. They order a drink, but Kinita's employer notices her and tells them she will not be served in this restaurant. Matthew decides that they should get out of the restaurant. He tells her he has a house in the country and they decide to go there. Kinita says she is happy to be with him and she promises to be his mistress once they get there. Matthew and Kinita arrive at the luxurious country home. They enter and Kinita notices a picture of a woman. Matthew tells her it is his wife who died a few years ago and he loved her very much. Kinita doesn't feel comfortable staying in the same room and asks Matthew to have another room made up for the two of them. Matthew calls the service and asks the woman to prepare the room, and she tells them the room will be ready in 5 minutes. Matthew asks about Kinita's mother and she says her mother doesn't know she is there, but she has raised herself ever since she was a child and she is allowed to do as she pleases. She calls him Matteo and asks him if he will love her forever, and to confirm that he will love her even if he doesn't mean it. She ponders on the thought of never being with another man after him and they continue talking for a while. During their stay, Kinita decides that she is not ready to spend the night with Matthew. She tells him she doesn't have the strength, and later that she is not in the mood, and Matthew becomes impatient. She takes a part of her clothes off in front of the mirror and tells him to look at how beautiful she is. Matthew tells her that he won't allow herself to be teased like this anymore. Kinita asks him to at least put out the candles. He tries to kiss her and tells her skin is smooth, but then realizes she is wearing the underwear he can't take off. He turns the light back on and removes the cover from the bed. He asks Kinita what she is wearing and why he is unable to take off the underwear she has on her. She refuses to take it off and Matthew can't untangle the ribbons. He gets upset and starts crying. Kinita comforts him and asks him if he wants her to come and live with him. The next morning, Matthew and Edward are sitting in a restaurant. Edward asks Matthew if he truly can't live without her and why he refuses to marry her in that case. Matthew explains that if he marries her, he would be completely defenseless. Kinita arrives at the table. The waiter tells the manager the young lady is at the restaurant and he turns around to look at her. He fixes the tie and approaches the table. He offers her champagne, but Kinita doesn't feel like ordering anything. Matthew and Kinita are taking a walk on a lovely day. She is photographing him near the river and asks him if he would buy her a 16mm camera. He tells her they will look at some nice ones later. They arrive by the bench and Matthew picks up a bag. Kinita asks him why he insists on making love to her since she already hugs him and caresses him. Matthew tells her it is something all people do in relationships and it's normal. Kinita thinks he doesn't consider her normal, and they continue their walk. Matthew is reading newspapers about another explosion. Matthew and Kinita are in the bedroom and he is waiting for her to join him. Kinita agrees to take off her clothes, but she wants Matthew to promise they will only hug and talk in the bed. Matthew agrees and asks her how long he will need to wait. While they are talking, they hear a noise outside of the building. There is a shooting outside and men are running and driving away in cars. Matthew asks Kinita if she saw what happened and she explains she couldn't see any details. She returns to Matthew and asks if he will wait for her, but he tells her to get out. Kinita leaves the room and locks herself. Matthew goes after her and knocks on her door. Kinita is in the room waiting for one of her friends to hide behind a couch. Matthew walks in and realizes Kinita is not alone in the room. He tells them both to get out. Kinita tries to persuade Matthew her friend has been in her room for the past few days only because he had no other place to be. Kinita's friend says he will wait for her outside and leaves. Matthew tells Kinita she has 10 minutes to pack her bags and go. She gets hurt and angry for hearing him say that. She tells him she needs less time than that to be gone forever, and that he will never see her again. Sometime later, Matthew is talking with Edward about Kinita and how he can't stop thinking about her. A group of men park outside of the home of Kinita and her mother. They knock on the door and Kinita's mother, Encarnacion, opens it. One of the men introduces himself and says they are from the police. Kinita enters the room to find out what is happening, and the police officer reads the expulsion order and tells them they both have 24 hours to leave the country. Encarnacion asks why they need to leave and what have they done, but the officer tells them he doesn't know and he is only here to read the order. Matthew is telling Martin about his plan to travel to Singapore, but Martin is skeptical. He asks what they will do around there. In the end, they decide to go to Seville. As Matthew later explains to the psychologist, and the other passengers during the ride on the train. Matthew and Martin arrive in Seville, and Matthew is interested in learning more about Martin. He asks him what he thinks about women, and Martin remembers what one of his friends used to say about women and tells it to Matthew. Matthew lights a cigarette and tells Martin he is free for the day because he has a dinner invitation later that day. As they are walking, two women approach them, and one of them reads Matthew's fortune. He doesn't understand what she is saying because she is speaking in Spanish. He gives the women some money and they continue walking. Matthew encounters Conchita and her mother Encarnacion, who are delighted to see him. They tell him they got expelled from the country and had to get from the border to Seville without any money. Luckily, Conchita found the job very fast. Conchita invites him to go and see her dance on the stage, and Matthew accepts. He arrives and watches as Conchita passionately dances to Spanish music with other girls. Afterwards, they meet and talk for a while. Conchita soon needs to leave again to have her half-an-hour nap so she wouldn't daydream on the stage. One of the women working with Conchita sits at Matthew's table and tells him Conchita told her about him. Matthew mentions Conchita's half-hour nap break, and the woman tells him to go upstairs and see for himself what kind of a break it is. Matthew goes upstairs looking for Conchita and sees her almost naked in a room full of men. Driven by rage, he enters the room and tells everyone to leave. Conchita gets angry at him. She doesn't think he had any right to drive those men away. She explains she was only dancing in front of the tourists, not sleeping with them. She says that she needs to stay true to herself and she is the most valuable thing she has in her life. Matthew eventually stops getting mad at her and they agree that Conchita should come live with him. Matthew tells her she only needs to tell him what she needs and he will get it for her. Sometime later, they meet at her home and Matthew gives her an envelope. Conchita promises to meet him at midnight the following day. Matthew arrives and Conchita greets him at the doorway but doesn't unlock the gate. At first, she is polite, but she then starts frantically laughing. She says she has a lot to tell him, that she can't stand him, that she tried to get away but he would catch up with her, and that she hated him kissing her. Conchita's friend appears and Conchita says that, if Matthew doesn't want to leave, he is going to watch them kiss and make out in front of him. Matthew is shaken up by what he is seeing and he leaves, but then comes back a few moments later. Conchita comments that she knew he would return and she then leaves with her friend. Matthew's car suddenly stops. The driver sees a man lying on the floor. He exits the car to check what is happening and the man hits him, and another man with the gun orders Matthew to exit the car and leave. Matthew is sitting in the garden and having breakfast. The waitress brings juice but Matthew doesn't feel like eating or drinking anything. He is reading the newspapers. Conchita appears in the garden and sits next to him. She puts a rose in his pocket and says that she needs to tell him something but not in the garden. They go inside the house and Conchita admits that what happened the night before was a charade, and the friend she was with, El Mornito, doesn't even like women. She also tells him he doesn't understand women and that, just because he gave her a house, doesn't mean he owns her. Matthew is enraged by her words and by what happened before and he hits her, and continues hitting her until Conchita kneels down in front of him and tells him that he can visit her anytime. Matthew throws away the key she returned and leaves the room. Matthew is about to finish his story to the passengers on the train. Conchita is walking through the train with a bucket of water. She finds Matthew and spills the water over him. Matthew gets up and goes after her. They both exit the train together and enter the car with their bags. Some time later they are walking through the street as the public announcement is talking about the recent attacks. They stop in front of the shop window and observe the woman sitting in a chair and sewing. The cloth she is holding is bloody but she continues to sew anyway. Conchita moves away from the window shop but Matthew stays for a while. He continues walking to catch up with Conchita, and then the explosion blows up the area.